Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about atheism just a little bit, and why basically it's missing some very key and integral components in order to reach the culture that they're critiquing. And, okay, so here we go. Atheism, by practical definitions, is the rejection of mythical deities. Now, the rejection of mythical deities, by definition, doesn't necessarily mean the rejection of spirituality. Now, I understand pretty well what atheists often say to this, and they probably respond with, well, you see, it's sort of a given that we reject not only deities, but any form of the supernatural, and there's a reason for this. It's the belief that there is no proof for the supernatural. There is no outright evidence for anything that is beyond the physical. So that is where they stand. They basically say anything religious whatsoever has absolutely no insight into reality, because what does have insight into reality is empirical scientific research. That is basically what we've been using for hundreds of years, and it's revolutionized society. So why would we return to these supernatural, metaphysical belief systems which have no grounding in actual evidence and scientific support? And to a degree I understand this, but there are 3 points that are also quite credible in response to that. The first one is, even if you are a empirical rationalist, so to speak, a scientist, from a scientific point of view, you can only, and this is according to modern views in scientific fields and in atheism, you can only believe what is proven to be valid. So you can only believe in what has been shown to be empirically true through repeatable experiments, data that continues to pop up, pretty much airtight theories, things like that. So you can only believe in something like that. However, this is not necessarily true, because we know that we can't always just believe on what is already known. For instance, you could have been an empirical rationalist 100 years ago, and there was by far very little evidence for any kind of for any rational empirical explanation for brain activity. Now, we knew the brain was somewhat we knew we had some degree of knowledge about the brain, how it helped us think. However, we had no clue where exactly our thoughts arose and where our emotions came from exactly. Now we know that this is a complex interaction between neurological chemistry and biological, a very complex neurobiological interaction, and we can see where emotions happen in the brain, and we can see where certain areas in the brain light up based on our thought patterns. Now, 100 years ago, this wasn't possible. Yet, we kind of knew, I mean, an empiricist 200 years ago, 100 years ago, probably had an idea that, well, you know what, the brain has something to do with what we think about. But there was no evidence for that. So, it's almost counterintuitive to strictly or literally or fundamentally just follow the empirical evidence, because it's not just the empirical evidence that is what is important, but it's also the evidence, the intuitions, and the things that aren't counterintuitive to us. For instance, we knew we had emotions before we could prove there are emotions. They have always existed. We knew we've had thoughts before we could prove that there was empirical evidence for thoughts. We knew a lot of things before we could prove them. And then we also knew a lot of things that, after a while, were disproven. Okay, so what evidence do we have that spirituality spiritual experiences, let me be very specific here. The spiritual experience, the mystical experiences, even prayer, what evidence do we actually have that says that it's not some kind of valid form of experience in the mind? It's not that it's not grounded in the brain, for instance. In fact, if anything, there's been more evidence for spiritual experiences being grounded in the brain, being, well, existing because the brain allows it to exist. Now, emotions and thoughts and feelings and memories and dreams and our ego and our psyche all exist because the brain exists. We can't have any of that without the brain. So then the question arises, well, what is spirituality? And, I mean, it's not just some kind of delusional offset. It's been part of the human experience just as long as human emotion has been. So this is a very real aspect of our consciousness and of our mind, and dismissing it as gibberish would be as equally foolish as dismissing emotions and love and the conceptual understanding of poetry and drama. These things are difficult to pinpoint rationally. For instance, I can't give you a scientific empirical evidence for the meaning of Shakespeare. It's an internal interpretation. It has to be understood hermeneutically, or in other words, directly through your experience. So, and it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We can all kind of talk about it and share it, and we know it's a guy who wrote a story, and we know what a story is, and the experiences and the emotions and the thoughts that the story induces. So we have that. So when it comes to spirituality, it's kind of strange how they can just dismiss it. So that's the first thing. You can't dismiss spirituality as just a delusion. You can't dismiss spirituality as some kind of brain fart. It's something that's real to some degree, at least as real as an emotional experience. What it implies is interesting as well. For instance, you can tell a story and have an emotional reaction to a story, and perhaps the story was meant in order to have that reaction in you. It's some kind of psychological lesson, something meant to be imparted to you directly to help you understand yourself and the world around you. This is the point of literature and sometimes the point of art and aesthetics. Spirituality can't be separated from that. I think it's a part of that. So you have it there. So the whole atheist reduction of it to being merely brain states. Well, if they're going to say it's merely brain states, they're going to have to say that love is merely brain states, which it is, but we don't make a point of emphasizing that. We know it's brain states. I think it would be good for atheists not to focus on trying to chop down the metaphysical forest that a lot of religions have created. You know, they keep trying to say, oh, there's nothing beyond us, there's nothing beyond the physical. Get off your ideological horses and come down and see reality as it is. Good, but that's really not all that spirituality is saying, and I'm going to continue this in the next video. And secondly, spirituality is also trying to convey some kind of inner experience, some kind of human contemplative experience. And there are many forms of spirituality, many different levels, just as there are many different levels of psychological understanding and of knowledge. And I'll be getting to that in the next video, part 2. So stay tuned.